Now, this is the highlight of the day here, folks. I found this article on the Sloan Management Review. There is a very definite push to produce some very major blockchains out there, and we'll highlight a couple of them. And they're big names that you'll have heard before, which is really, really cool. The first point that they wanted to make is that the applications that have been successful, the blockchain has really been the backstory. In other words, it's been the technology that drove it, but what implementing the technology has created so much other good. And so I've already talked a lot about TradeLens, started by Maersk in some of the videos that you've seen, and I'll continue talking about those in the videos that you've seen. I want to give you an update because this article gives us a bit of an update, an idea more of what's happened with that blockchain since it was initially rolled out. So they started in 2013, and at that point, the shipping industry internationally relied on paper. So you've seen these huge container ships that have hundreds, sometimes thousands of containers just on the deck, and they're just moving it from place to place. Well, can you imagine having a bill of lading for every single container? And that when you docked, you had this big stack of paper that you had to present to the port that you've just arrived in. And if it's international, can you imagine how long it takes to get through all that paperwork to see what you have on each container and get it through the port and get it moving on to its location? Huge problems for the shipping lines because they would spend more time in port than they'd spend actually moving the goods. And so that was a problem that was ready to be solved, that just needed to be solved. So they started working with partners and regulators. The challenge was that if you're a competitor to Maersk, do you want to really go into business with them in the same data structures with them? Would you ever want to share a data warehouse with them and commingle your data with their data? Well, that was the challenge that existed at the beginning of trying to put together the TradeLens blockchain. So the most difficult challenge, as it says here, is companies like CMA, CGM, Mediterranean Shipping, Hapag-Lloyd, and I've seen their containers a lot, Ocean Network Express, they were initially wary about joining a platform created by Maersk. In other words, I don't want to, share my data with you. Well, after a while, Maersk realized that they needed to create a thing called a customer advisory board. When they did that, they brought together 175 organizations. Those organizations worked with 600 ports and terminals around the world. Eventually, they got enough of what they call minimum viable ecosystem together. And that minimum viable ecosystem then led to an actually viable blockchain system that had enough nodes on it that they could distribute the network and get everybody working. And the idea here is that it's not a public blockchain like you would see in Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin can't hardly process enough to even begin to compete with Visa and MasterCard and those credit card companies. They just can't process enough transactions fast enough. So I don't know how they're going to solve that problem yet. But what a private blockchain does is it gives permissions, like, for example, when Ocean Network Express joins the blockchain, they get their permissions, and their permissions allow them to see through their private key, allows them to see their data. It's kind of like having a wallet in a blockchain system. You can see your transactions and see how much actually you have in the Bitcoin network, but other people can only see transactions. They can see that the transactions happened, but it's all encrypted and they can't see what the transaction was about. So the point here is that these 175 organizations then posted 1.6 billion events, transactions. I'm not sure exactly what constitutes an event. 14 million documents. In other words, the blockchain actually created those bills of lading and those documents that were needed by all the customs officials and the places that they needed to dock and transfer their goods. And they've transferred now 34 million containers. Can you imagine the number of container ships that it takes to transport 34 million containers? And it went through the blockchain. So the platform's business value includes reduced administrative costs, better tracking of the containers, and faster processing of documents through that supply chain. Now, if you really understand what Maersk is, they don't just have these big shipping containers that you see on the roads on the back of semi-trucks. They also, of course, have big container cargo ships. They also have their own trucking firms. They're really an end-to-end shipper in a lot of ways. So it was a big deal for just Maersk to have this in place, but now other companies are beginning to benefit. Now, the whole point here is that you've got to get in bed with the enemy, so to speak. In other words, Hapag-Lloyd is a major competitor to Maersk. They'd love to be bigger than Maersk, but Maersk is the biggest. Why would I ever want to do business in the same software package as Maersk? Well, the reason they're doing it is because of the great benefits that they have in sharing that common code and common system and being able to benefit by that. Let's talk about Walmart for a minute. I have disparaged Walmart and their blockchain in other videos, but it's nice to see kind of an update as to where they did. Remember last week I talked about Golden State Foods? Well, see, Walmart needed to solve a problem. We talked a little bit about the E. coli breakout in the romaine lettuce a couple weeks ago. And because of that outbreak of the E. coli, blockchain could help that. Well, here's a situation where blockchain does in fact help that situation. So with IBM, Walmart decided to begin putting together a blockchain. And it was called the IBM Food Trust. And we highlighted the case study of Golden State Foods using the IBM Food Trust. And here's a little bit more bigger part of that story. Not only did the IBM Food Trust get put together, but Dole, Nestle, Kroger, these three I've heard of. I haven't heard of Carrefour, Danone. I've heard of Driscoll's or GS1. But you can see that there were a lot of major companies that got into this same blockchain, basically referred to as the IBM Food Trust. Of course, IBM was the vendor of the blockchain technology, and they worked with consultants to be able to put this together. So here they have a blockchain that now they have a lot of their vendors and suppliers all the way from the field all the way to the store. So here it talks about some of the details. The implementation teams worked for 7 months to onboard more than 100 Walmart suppliers of leafy greens, and by the end of 2020, they had 280 members, 40 million transactions, and 25,000 SKUs. The IBM Food Trust is huge. We talk about public blockchains versus private blockchains. Now, part of the challenge with a public blockchain is that in order to keep fraud out of the blockchain, in order to keep hackers from penetrating the blockchain, each of the computers has to do proof of work algorithms in order to keep it safe. So with a public blockchain, blockchains like Bitcoin can't process enough transactions to grow large. Part of the challenge is when instead of putting a public blockchain out there that is public facing, anybody can join it, you have what they call private blockchains, where the blockchain is permissioned and only people who are given permission to get an account in the blockchain are allowed into the blockchain, of course. So, the organization that runs the blockchain, which in Walmart's example would be that consortium of Walmart and Dole and Nestle and so forth. In order to get into their blockchain or start utilizing it, you would have to be invited to it, or you would have to apply to get an account on that blockchain and use it. What this survey found is that private blockchains are much more prevalent in that space simply because they can process a whole lot more transactions in a better time. They ensure confidentiality. One example of one of those private blockchains that we've talked about is CoreConX. Now, the core chain is CoreConX's solution for international securities finance. So it is formed exclusively to handle global financial securities. So if you're buying international stocks from an international location, you might want to go to the core chain to have cross-border ability to purchase stocks. It uses the Hyperledger Fabric, which is IBM's trademark, and they have developed this blockchain in order to help with that particular issue. The part in here that was interesting to me is that the reason why they needed to use a private blockchain, they could not put people on a public-facing blockchain. They chose a private blockchain. We operate in a highly regulated environment, they say, and couldn't imagine our small business owners posting transactions on public networks. Just wouldn't have happened. So, or they couldn't figure how they'd learn to manage their own digital wallets. So they developed that blockchain to move around the ownership of stocks, bonds, and other securities in order to facilitate these small business owners getting their product out and getting their stock into people's hands. Public offerings of their stock allow them to expand and to grow. It's one form of financing for small businesses. The key here, though, is that not only did they develop the blockchain, but they also allowed that blockchain to operate on multiple cloud services. So you see here on IBM or Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, Google, DigitalOcean, it doesn't matter where they want to put their part of the blockchain. They could operate their blockchain in any one of the clouds, depending on where that particular business wanted to put their node and their software. So by having a private chain, they could allow people to join it. But when they created and stood up a node, the business could put it in their own data closet, their own data servers, or they could put it in any one of these cloud services. So they onboarded 105,000 private companies. We're talking bigger than Maersk and bigger than Walmart's food blockchain. That kind of gives you a good highlight for the kind of blockchains that are out there and what their purpose is. Their purpose literally is about building trust. And when you can build trust, you build efficiency. And when you build efficiency, you lower costs. And so hopefully this whole process will mean a better running society worldwide. So I really appreciate you joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you again later. And thanks for joining.